Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the world of Ampelosaurus atasis.
hmm
That's a titanosaur sauropod that once roamed what is now France, way back in the late Cretaceous.
Yeah, and what really grabs you about this one, I think, is its whole context. It's living on this prehistoric island.
Right, an island ecosystem.
Yeah,
So we've got a stack of scientific papers, descriptions. We're really going to try and unpack what makes this vine lizard so interesting.
exactly. And it lived about, what, 71.5 million years ago, early Maastrichtian. Its story really starts with its discovery in France.
Okay, so how did we find out about this vine lizard? I get the feeling it wasn't just one big dig.
Oh, definitely not. It was piecemeal. The very first hint was way back in 1877.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah, just a couple of vertebrae found then. Then, early 20th century, some other isolated bones turned up near Campeche-Girard.
Cool.
But, they kind of got lost in the shuffle, didn't really register properly.
Huh. Forgotten pieces of a giant puzzle. So what actually brought it back into the light?
Well, a bit of luck, really, and some dedicated amateurs. In 1982, Pierre Klotz and Christian Reynaud, they rediscovered these sites in the Upper Aude Valley.
Okay.
Apparently, a hunter had stumbled on something the year before, quite by accident. And these guys, Klotz and Reynaud, they started just collecting what they could see on the surface.
Just surface finds, what sort of thing?
Mostly bits of tail vertebrae, some limb bone fragments, scattered
Oh,
around.
that was enough to get the professionals interested.
It was. By 1989, proper systematic excavations started, led by paleontologists, particularly at the Bellevue farm site.
Bellevue Farm.
Yeah, and that's when things really took off. They started finding lots of bones, clearly from a sauropod, but one nobody had described before.
Which leads us to the name, Ampelosaurus atasis. It sounds evocative. There's a story there.
There is. Jean Lelouf, the French paleontologist, named it in 1995. Ampelosaurus, that means vine lizard,
Vine lizard, why?
because the bones were found right near the Blanquet de Limoux vineyard.
Oh, that's brilliant. And atasis.
That's from Atax, the Latin name for the local river, the Aude. So vine lizard of the Aude River.
I love that, connecting it right to the landscape. So what initial bits and pieces convinced Lelouf this was something new?
Well, the first official description was based on surprisingly little material, actually. There was a tooth,
Just one?
and 3 back vertebrae, still joined together that they became the holotype, the main reference specimen, plus a neural spine from another vertebra, and also 4 osteoderms.
Osteoderms. So armor plates.
Exactly, those bony bits in the skin. They attributed those to Ampelosaurus right from the start.
But surely our picture's filled out since 1995.
Oh, absolutely. Much more came later. In 2005, we got a much fuller description, crucially including a brain case and a dentary part of the lower jaw. That gave us a peek at its head.
Okay, skull material. That's always good.
Very good. And then there was a really big find back in 2001, though it took years to excavate fully. A skeleton, mostly complete, of a young adult, nicknamed Eva,
Eva, how big was she?
around 10 meters long. So not fully grown, maybe. And then later, in 2007, they found parts of an even larger individual, including a thigh bone, a femur that was 1.2 meters long.
Whoa. Okay, so Eva and a giant femur gives you a sense of the scale. Now, for ages, people thought Ampelosaurus was the only titanosaur hanging out there, right?
That was the standard view, yeah.
Hmm.
For more than 20 years, actually. Everyone assumed Ampelosaurus atasis was the only titanosaur at Bellevue.
And differences in bones were just...
Just individual variation.
Yeah.
Like people vary. That was the thinking.
But that started to change.
It did. A study in 2012 shook things up a bit. They looked closely at titanosaur thigh bones from France and Spain, comparing shapes and sizes. Morphometrics.
And what did they find at Bellevue?
They suggested there were actually 3 different types of thigh bone there. 3 morphotypes. And they tentatively suggested one type might belong to Liverinosaurus, which is another European titanosaur.
Okay, so maybe Ampelosaurus wasn't alone after all.
That was the implication. It certainly sparked debate.
I bet. Was there pushback?
Yep. The next year, 2013, Veronica Diaz and her team argued against that interpretation. They showed those particular Bellevue femurs were actually different in key ways from the known Lorinosaurus estibie femurs.
Ah, so not Lyrinosaurus then, but maybe still something else.
Exactly. The question remained open. It shows how science works,
Yeah.
New data, new analysis, reevaluation.
So where are we now? Does Ampelosaurus have company at Bellevue or not?
Well, the consensus has definitely shifted. By 2021, Diaz Diaz and others agreed, yes, there is a second titanosaur type at Bellevue.
Really? What could it mean?
Interestingly, they found it seemed more similar to Garrigatitan, which is known from slightly older rocks in France.
Okay.
And then just last year, 2023, preliminary findings were presented that basically confirm it. There's a new distinct titanosaur species at Bellevue.
Wow. A whole new species alongside Ampelosaurus.
Looks like it. Which means paleontologists now have the job of going back through all the titanosaur bones from Bellevue, figuring out which bone belongs to which species, and probably revising the original description of Ampelosaurus itself.
So the vine lizard might have shared its vineyard. That really changes the picture of that ancient island.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot to Ampelosaurus itself. What did it actually look like? Standard sauropod shape, long neck, long tail.
Pretty much, yeah, that classic silhouette. But the really cool thing, as we mentioned, was the armor.
The osteoderms. Tell me more about those.
Right. So bony plates embedded in the skin. They weren't huge, maybe 25 to 28 centimeters long, something like that.
Okay.
And they came in different shapes. Some were quite flat, like plates. Others were more rounded, bulbous. And some were even conical or spiny.
Spikes.
Sort of, yeah. Two of the spined ones found had these noticeable large holes, foramina, at their base, maybe for blood vessels or nerves anchoring them. We're not totally sure.
So a big plant eater with built-in body armor. Cool. How big are we talking overall? You mentioned Eva at 10 meters and that bigger femur.
Current estimates generally put a typical adult Ampelosaurus around 15 or 16 meters long.
So maybe 50 feet or so?
Yeah, roughly 49 to 52 feet. And body mass, maybe around 8 metric tons. That's about 8.8 short tons. But remember, we also have evidence of smaller individuals, like one estimated around 6.7 meters and 3.5 tons. Probably different growth stages present.
Right, a range. What about its head? You mentioned the brain case and jaw fragment and the teeth.
Yeah, the teeth are quite specific. They're sort of cylindrical near the top, but then they have these thin, flattened expansions near the bottom. Almost spoon-like, but not quite.
How does that compare to other titanosaurs?
It's different. Different from Megasaurus or Loranosaurus from Europe, and definitely different from the really peg-like teeth you see in some other titanosaur groups, like the Saltosaurids. So the teeth, the brain case, the jaw. They give us important clues.
Okay. And moving down the body, the rest of the skeleton, anything stand out in the bones?
Yeah, a few things. The shoulder blade, the scapula, it's got this triangular blade shape, gets narrower towards the outer end. And interestingly, it lacks a bony ridge on top, a dorsal crest that some other titanosaurs have.
Mm-hmm.
Then the coracoid, another shoulder bone, is kind of squarish, thicker at the front edge.
Mm.
The pubis bone in the pelvis is strongly widened at the bottom end and has a big hole, a foramen, that's different from many South American titanosaurs.
Okay.
And the ischium, the other main lower pelvic bone, is pretty flat and doesn't widen out much at its end.
And the limbs, you said the femur was common.
Very common at Bellevue, yeah. It's
Yeah.
notably flat front to back. The biggest one known is 1.1 meters long.
Wow.
The ulna, one of the forearm bones, is interesting too. They found two distinct sizes. One is small and slender and doesn't have that bony elbow point, the olecranon process. The other one's much larger and more robust.
Different individuals or maybe even linked to the different species question.
That's part of the puzzle they need to resolve now, yeah.
Yeah.
And the humerus, the upper arm bone, it's sturdy, expanded at both ends, but generally smaller than the biggest femurs. And weirdly, it doesn't seem to have a big open medullary cavity inside, at least not a completely free one.
No marrow cavity. Interesting. What about the backbone, neck and tail?
Right. The neck vertebrae, the cervicals, are opisthosceles, ball at the front, socket at the back, gives flexibility.
Makes sense for a long neck.
Yep. The back vertebrae, the dorsals, have these upward-pointing neural spines that get wider towards the tip and lean backwards. And the tail vertebrae, the caudals, are all proculus, socket at the front, ball at the back. They're kind of squashed side to side. And their neural spines are narrow, tall, and also point backwards.
Got it. And internally?
Very spongy bone structure inside the vertebrae. Lots of air spaces, which helps lighten the skeleton. Common in sauropods.
Okay, that's a lot of anatomical detail. How does this whole package, especially the osteoderms and tail features, help scientists figure out where Ampelosaurus fits in the grand scheme of things?
Well, those features firmly place it within Titanosauria. And more specifically, because of the Procobulus tail vertebrae and the osteoderms, within a more advanced group called Lithostrotia.
Lithostrotia, the armored titanosaurs, more or less.
Kind of, yeah, though not all necessarily had armor. And current thinking places it within a subgroup called Lorinosaurinae.
Lorinosaurinae.
Yeah, that's a group mostly containing titanosaurs from the late Campanian and Maastrichtian of France and Spain. Ampelosaurus is often considered a close relative, maybe a sister taxon, to another one called Atsinganosaurus.
But it's debated.
Oh yeah, its exact position is bounced around a bit. Earlier on, it was sometimes put in Saltosauridae or even just Titanosauridae, which is a more general grouping. The family tree is always being refined as we find more fossils and do more analyses.
Constantly updating the dinosaur directory. So what were those key features Liveruf originally hung his hat on to say, this is Ampelosaurus?
He pointed to that unique tooth shape, the way the neural spines on the back vertebrae widened and leaned back, the shape of the shoulder blade lacking that wide end and having a slight ridge underneath, and of course those three different types of osteoderms. Later, he also mentioned the narrowness of the neural spines in the neck and back as potentially distinctive.
Okay. Let's switch gears a bit to its life. Paleobiology. The sources mention some interesting things about its growth, especially being on an island.
Yes, that's fascinating. When scientists looked at the microstructure of its bones, the histology—
Setting bones open, basically.
exactly, thin sections under the microscope, they found its growth pattern started off looking pretty similar to more basic earlier sauropods. But then at some point the bone tissue changes quite a bit, suggesting its growth rate slowed down significantly.
Ah, the island effect again. Limited resources may be slowing growth.
That's the hypothesis, yes, a pattern seen in some island animals. But here's the weird part. Even though the growth apparently slowed, the bones don't show really clear, distinct growth lines or elags, arrested growth, that you normally expect with seasonal slowdowns or pauses.
Huh. So, slow growth, but continuous bone laying.
Kind of. It's this unusual combination that's not typical for sauropods. Bit of a puzzle.
And did it reach a definite maximum size? What about that EFS thing?
Right, the external fundamental system. That's like a final layer of very slow-growing bone on the outside surface, signaling the animal has pretty much stopped growing skeletally.
Did Ampelosaurus have it?
Well, it hasn't been clearly identified in the Ampelosaurus bones studied so far, which is interesting because quite a few other titanosaurs also seem to lack a really obvious EFS. Even Europasaurus, that dwarf island sauropod, doesn't seem to show it clearly in the studied bones. But the key study on Ampelosaurus histology didn't include samples from the absolute largest individuals found, like the owner of that 1.2-meter femur. So we can't completely rule out that the biggest ones might have had an EFS.
Okay, so still some unknowns there. Anything else from the bone structure?
Yeah, the internal structure shows dense secondary bone remodeling, osteons, in the inner parts, but less so in the outer cortex. The orientation of these osteons is also a bit unusual, and as mentioned, some limb bones lack that big open marrow cavity. It all points towards complex growth dynamics and probably means the bones we have represent animals at different life stages.
So its whole life story, right down to the bone microstructure, seems tied to that island existence. Let's talk more about that home. Paleoecology. Where and when, precisely?
Okay, so the definite Ampelosaurus fossils come from the base of a rock unit called the Marne de la Marine member in the Upper Aude Valley, southwestern France.
And the timing.
Paleomagnetic dating puts this layer right in the early Maastrichtian age of the late Cretaceous, about 71.5 million years ago.
And the environment. What was this Ibero-American island like?
It was a pretty big landmass, covering much of modern France and the Iberian Peninsula. Europe was more like an archipelago back then. The specific environment where Ampelosaurus lived seems to have been extensive floodplains, crisscrossed by river channels.
And it wasn't alone on this floodplain, right? You mentioned that other potential titanosaur. What else lived there?
Oh, it was a busy place.
Yeah.
Besides the other titanosaurs still unnamed, we have the plant-eater Rhabdodon priscus. That's an ornithopod. There was some kind of notosaurid ankylosaur, another armored dino.
Okay.
Also, teeth suggest an indeterminate dromaeosaurid, a raptor-like predator. And the non-dinosaurs, too.
Yeah.
The giant flightless bird,
So
Gargantuavis.
giant bird.
Yeah. And some kind of pterosaur, flying reptile. Turtles like foxmays. An early croc relative, an Allodoposuchid, and various fish, even a coleocanth, Axarotypus.
Wow, quite the fauna list. A real snapshot of life on that island. What about babies? Any eggs found?
Yep, definitely. They found several different types of fossil dinosaur eggs O species in those same rock layers. Some clearly belong to titanosaurs, types called Megalolithus and Fusiolithus. Others likely belong to notosaurids, Carinolithus, and maybe Dromaeosaurids, Montanolithus. So breeding was happening there.
And plants. What was Ampelosaurus eating?
Well, the fossil flora gives us clues. They found macroflora bits of actual plants like palm tree leaves, cycad leaves, and fossil wood from angiosperms, flowering plants. The wood suggests trees grew maybe 10 to 15 meters tall.
So a decent amount of vegetation, palm trees, cycads, other trees. Sounds fairly lush.
Enough to support a large herbivore, definitely. A well-vegetated floodplain environment.
Okay, let's zoom out one last time. Biogeography. Ampelosaurus in the bigger picture of European dinosaurs and that turnover you mentioned.
Right, so titanosaurs as a whole were doing great in the Cretaceous, globally widespread. And the Aurora Moroccan Island was certainly a titanosaur hotspot in the late Cretaceous. There were common large herbivores there.
But things changed. The Maastrichtian dinosaur turnover.
Exactly. There seems to have been a shift in the fauna. The earlier Maastrichtian fauna, which included Ampelosaurus, also had other relatively smaller or moderate-sized titanosaurs like Atsinganosaurus, Gargantin, Lyranosaurus, maybe local Catan.
The local island fauna, perhaps?
Kinda, yeah. Many showing possible signs of island effects, like potentially reduced size or slower growth compared to giant mainland forms. But later in the Maastrichtian, this assemblage seems to get replaced, or at least supplemented, by a different set of dinosaurs.
Replaced by what?
By larger titanosaurs, for one. Animals like Adaptations found in Spain seem much larger and have stronger evolutionary links to titanosaurs from Gondwana, the southern continents.
So immigrants arriving.
That's the idea. These later titanosaurs don't show the same potential island adaptations. They look more like arrivals from elsewhere, maybe dispersing from Africa or other parts of Gondwana when sea levels perhaps dropped briefly, creating land connections around 70.6 million years ago.
A faunal exchange event.
Possibly, yeah. It suggests the island wasn't totally isolated throughout this period. And just a quick note, while people have claimed to find Ampelosaurus bones elsewhere in France and Spain, most of those identifications are now questioned or haven't been confirmed. Bellevue really is the key site for understanding this particular dinosaur.
So Ampelosaurus was part of that earlier, possibly more island-adapted group that eventually saw new, larger neighbors arrive. It really paints a dynamic picture. Okay, let's try and wrap this up. Key takeaways from our deep dive on the vine lizard.
Hawaii is a fantastic example of a European titanosaur. Firstly, distinguished by that unique armor. Secondly, the ongoing science around it, especially the discovery of likely another titanosaur living right alongside it. That's exciting.
Right, the story's still unfolding.
Definitely.
Okay.
And thirdly, its existence on that island, how that might have shaped its biology, its growth. And finally, its place in that bigger story of dinosaur faunal change in Europe just before the very end of the Cretaceous.
It covers a lot of ground. Which leaves us with a final thought. Considering that complex island world, the pressures, the eventual arrival of potentially competing species, what does the story of Ampelosaurus and its eventual disappearance from the record tell us about resilience and change in these ancient ecosystems? What drove its specific adaptations, like the armor, and what ultimately led to it being replaced?
Yeah, exactly. What were the tipping points on that island? Lots to ponder.
Indeed. Well, thanks for guiding us through the world of Ampelosaurus. Fascinating stuff.
My pleasure. It's a great dinosaur to talk about.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.